Hello students, this is Alan Boris speaking to you once again from my office here in the Anthropology Lab at Kenai Peninsula College. And this is Denaina Prehistory. First I'd like to talk about how prehistory is understood. We normally equate prehistory with archaeology, literally prehistory meaning before a written history. And the techniques of archaeology are obviously well suited to figuring out the story from the standpoint of artifacts and sites and analysis and all of that. But it's also true that techniques in linguistics can be used to understand prehistory, and we'll use I'll touch on that just a bit in this particular lecture. As well as mythology or cultural narrative. Stories have an amazing endurance, and I am continually amazed at the relevance of Denaina stories, Denaina myth in the sense of a true story as the people understand it in terms of understanding prehistory. And we can infer from ethnography. It's, of course, a lot harder to do when it's very old, but the Denaina of Cook Inlet are the interface between prehistory and history, contact and pre-contact. So there is much we can do, we can learn from the ethnographic record to understand the prehistoric record. And genetics and human biology has increasingly become important with advances in genome mapping and DNA studies and all of that. We won't talk about that in this class. That's being done. There's, in future, in the future there will be, I'm sure, much to learn in terms of how genetics plays in the prehistoric record in Alaska and in south central Alaska in particular. So for this, a bit of archaeology, a bit of linguistics, a bit of mythology and cultural narrative, and a heavy dose of ethnographic inference, all to understand the story. We return to this map, this chart, Denaina is here. So, and this is the interface between the riverine Kachemak for the Upper Peninsula and the Denaina. I will make the case repeatedly that the Denaina don't necessarily appear at 1000 AD as people, but they appear in the archaeological record, and that means that the sedentary Denaina, from whom we can get radiocarbon dates and have identifiable sites, appear at about 1000 AD. They were around for long periods of time before, and we should recognize that. Later in the lecture we'll talk about the coincidence of the Denaina, sedentary Denaina, in terms of the medieval optimum, a warm period, where there is increasing evidence that salmon abundance seems to respond to warmth, at least in northern waters, so that might play into the fact that the Denaina became sedentary salmon fishers, intensive sedentary salmon fishers. We have also encountered this chart before in the introduction to prehistory. It is laid out according to time on the left and various areas in the upper axis here. And this material, this is the same information as the previous chart, but this of course goes back to 10,000 BC. For the, shall we say, the outer inlet area, this is the sedentary Denaina riverine Kachemak interface. A little less clear here in the upper inlet, but nevertheless there. In Kachemak Bay, there's that little sedentary Denaina right in there. There apparently was a movement into Kachemak Bay, and so that expansion, if you will, seem to happen, and with an interface with the Lutig. I have this listed as Norton. That's an error. Doug Rieger corrected me on that. There is a pottery site in Kachemak Bay. It's not Norton, however. It's a different style of pottery. Norton is a style of pottery in southwest Alaska, pre-Yupik. And this is something else. So that's one of those things that has to be sorted out. This, however, is Norton. This is in the Iliamna area. The sedentary Denaina appear as well as in the inland area, about 1000 AD. And this is less clear in both the Iliamna and the inland area, mostly because of lack of archaeology. There hasn't been a lot of archaeology done in those areas, mainly because they're a little less accessible than the outer inlet, Kenai Peninsula, and the upper inlet, Susitna areas. So that's where we're headed, and we are going to look at the transition initially between riverine Kachemak and Denaina. So this map is another version of that. So this would be as the cultures would have existed around 500, 600 AD, somewhere in that area. Riverine Kachemak here in Cook Inlet, Marine Kachemak, Kachemak Bay, and Kodiak, with Denaina territory here in this area. There's nothing that precedes Denaina at that and supersedes Denaina at that time period. So eventually, at 1000 AD, we'll have Denaina moving in, displacing the riverine Kachemak, who then withdraw, or at least to the Yupik territory, probably in this area. At least that's a hypothesis. So let's talk about mythology and origin stories. There are a number. These are just two, and they play upon the Denaina view of. So one story takes place in the Stony River Lime Village area, Hitsatna, the first people, and this is a story told by Pete Bobby, who was an elder from that area, and is published in a small little pamphlet book. And the first line of that is Ka Kizretnu Helsh Hidrini Nantuta Naguna. I know I butchered that, but it's close. It means, they say, our ancestors were from Ka Kizretnu, Stony River. So here's Stony River. This is the village of Lime Village in this area here. And what Mr. Bobby is saying is that the stories talk about origins. This origin country out here in Stony River, this is actually in the Kuskokwim drainage. So far out in this far distant area here is the Kuskokwim Piedmont. And the stories talk about the origin of people coming from that area and moving into Denaina territory, eventually to saltwater, being the only Athabascan group at saltwater. The Eyak as well, a more distant Athabascan group. They say our ancestors were from Stony River. And that's a worthy read, if you could find that story. And it bears upon this issue. Another story is, it's not usually titled the Tlaquana Mountain Story. Pete Bobby has a version, Alexei Ivan has a version, two versions, and one in a book by Anna Ruth, and Peter Kalifornsky has a version. His is titled Imagination. It's on page 72, and you have that book in your packet on Blackboard. have the whole book, and you should read that version of the story. I will give a short version of it. They all agree, although some of the details are slightly different. It starts out the people are starving. Certainly a metaphor of trouble, maybe literally starving, maybe not, maybe a metaphor, but the people are starving in their homeland, which is identified as being in that same Kuskokwim Piedmont area, and they move south and west, and they encounter Talaquina Mountain. This is Talaquina Mountain, the prominent mountain as you come from the Kuskokwim Piedmont area toward what is now Denaina territory. There they meet a spirit. The spirit would be one of the Treli Denaye, one of the mountain people. Sometimes that spirit takes the form of a giant. Sometimes that spirit takes the form of one of the little people. In this particular case, in one version, it takes the form of a kingfisher. In another version, it takes the form of a little man, one of the little people. And they tell him of their troubles. And he's sympathetic, and he raps on the mountain. The mountain opens up, and there are game animals of all types. The people survive, and they thrive, and they spread out further into what is now Denaina territory. Certainly, we're not us to question literal or not literal, but from a metaphorical standpoint, it portrays the abundance of Denaina territory and the Denaina adaptation to that territory. We will end the class today, this lecture, with discussing how the Denaina became one of the great sustainable cultures, and that story sort of sets the stage for the beginning of it. So if you can, read Imagination on page 72 in Peter's book, and certainly the others are also a very important read. This is just a view from the Mulchatna River, the far western part of Denaina territory, giving you an idea of the landscape, that the First Peoples landscape from the Denaina standpoint. First People, and I don't want to say First People time-wise, but this would be sort of the heartland of Denaina territory as they then moved south and west. Another origin story is in Peter Kalifornsky's book, and it has to do with the origin of the Sky Clan. All of the clans, which we haven't talked about yet, but we will, have origin stories associated with them, and one is the Sky Clan, the Nolchina. And this has to do with Susitna Mountain. So here is Susitna Mountain. And on the map inset, this is Susitna Mountain in this area here. And they talk in the story, I apologize for not having the page number, but perhaps you can find the page number in Peter's book. He talks about the people coming to Susitna Mountain and from there spreading out in Cook Inlet, moving down Cook Inlet, and encountering places and establishing places, and encountering the Dudna. The Dudna means downriver people. It's the Denaina name for Yupik. And the Dudna, I believe, were then withdrawing, and the people's account is of occupying Cook Inlet, in this case from north to south. The Sky Clan story. In addition to stories, Sukdu, which is the Denaina name for story or mythology, there is linguistic evidence that needs to be brought together and pointed out. One is place name distribution. This is a map of Denaina territory here, and just a few of the thousands of place names in Denaina territory. But if I were to fill out all the little yellow dots here, that would essentially define Denaina territory with a little bit of overlap with adjoining peoples. So place names can become a very effective way of mapping culture, mapping territory. Another sort of interesting note on place names, Jim Carrey has talked about Kamishak Bay, and this is Kamishak Bay. So Kamishak Bay is right down here, right in that area. Here, I'll draw it. So here's Augustine Island right here, and this is Kamishak Bay. And I don't know exactly where the boundary is, but there's a place name that is on the north side of Kamishak Bay that in Denaina that translates as our place. And there's a place name on the southern side that translates as their place, and sort of an interesting take on the boundary, which is probably right about in that area right there between, in this case, Denaina to the north and Sugpiaq speakers or Alutiiq to the south. All of these bear upon prehistory and movements and territory and our understanding of how things came to be. Another type of evidence, this is very old, very dated now, but Harry Hoyer in the 60s wrote a book where he was applying lexicostatistics to Athabascan or Dene peoples, and the technique was to look at a set of 100-word list, sometimes they used a 200-word list, and look at cognates between languages. So here are, in the terminology of the 60s, he's spelling it Denaina, but we today would say Denaina, Koyukon, Tanana, Otna, and so on, but including also the other Athabascan speakers from Canada, from Northern California, and from the Southwest. And these are percentages, these numbers are percentages. So from that, say, 100-word list, there would be a 63% agreement of cognates. In other words, the same word occurs in Denaina as in Otna. And then the others are different words. So the concept is that the greater the number of cognates, the less time between when the two languages split. So Otna and Denaina would be the highest, and that stands to reason. Otna and Denaina are very close geographically and very close culturally. The least for Denaina is what? Is Hupa or Matoli. Hupa and Matoli are down in the 40% range. So these are Northern California Athabascan languages, so that would reflect a longer time of separation between whatever core Proto-Athabascan language there was, because there's less similarity in cognates, and of course over time eventually there would be zero cognates. Navajo is here at 55% between Navajo and Denaina. So this gives a relative indication of the separation. There have been attempts in lexicostatistics to give an actual date to this, but those have been proven to be not too effective because it assumes a constant rate of language change, and that is not usually the case, probably never the case. But the cognate data does give an indication of similarities, dissimilarities, and an indication of what happened over time. So we can look at this map and for Denaina territory, and we can say that there's evidence of movement from the Kuskokwim Piedmont in to the western side of Denaina territory. We also could say that there's evidence of movement in from Atna territory, and maybe both ways, I don't know, but there's a very close connection between Atna and the upper inlet dialect of Denaina in the Susitna River area. And this reflects a major break here. Whether these other arrows are actual movements or not, it really has to do with only the few passes, the Pile Bay Road Trail, Lake Clark Pass. There's a few other passes up here where there's movement, and then eventually onto the Kenai Peninsula. So mythology and linguistics do help shape our understanding. Archaeology less so, and archaeology less so because it's hard to track Denaina sites from artifacts alone, and we'll talk about that in a moment here. So I'm not sure why this slide is here, other than it's a beautiful slide of Cook Inlet and Mount Redoubt, and I guess we'll just enjoy the view and then go on to the radiocarbon dates as to when. So this is that same graph you're now tired of, but here Denaina appear at 1000 AD. It's important to note that this is the sedentary Denaina, and the dates then are usually associated with hearths of houses, not necessarily the campsites of earlier hunting Denaina, which would be harder to find and harder to locate, and therefore harder to date. So this would be an example of one. This was a spear point that was found in the Kenai Mountains. This is toward the head of Tustamina Lake, and you hike up to this high country. It's a difficult hike, but it's beautiful, well worth it. And this point was found right where I'm standing taking this picture. And it is probably Denaina. It's hard to say. And I show it to indicate the caribou hunting territory. This was a traditional caribou hunting territory. And before Denaina were sedentary, primarily salmon fishers. They never, of course, gave up caribou, but this would have been the type of site and the type of place where you might find very early evidence, whether it be on the Kenai Peninsula or anywhere else throughout Denaina territory. Sites above tree line indicating hunting. Here in the inset are Andrew Beluda, Pete Bobby, and his daughter Helen Dick discussing that point. It's in the tray here, and it's this point right here. That was a wonderful experience to hear them talk about it, even though they were talking about it in Denaina. And so I couldn't understand it. I could pick up a word here and there. But it was just, I was privileged to hear them discuss that point in the anthropology lab at Kenai Peninsula College. One part of me says I wish I would have had that recorded, and another part of me that would have broken the mood, broken the time, broken the sense of it. And I'm glad I was just there to watch and listen, and they let me take their picture. They also are discussing the attributes of the point in terms of Bagesh or Bagesha, and we will come to that concept in a moment. So the dates for the sedentary Denaina are almost all from hearths. We already talked about this hearth that is at that site down in Kachemak Bay, and a date from here, and a date from about here, and that corresponds to this date, and that corresponds to this date. And then the lower is Marine Kachemak tradition off the page here, off the picture, is where this date and this date came from. So Denaina at this site 1200 to 1400 AD, and we had already talked about the previous Kachemak tradition, Marine Kachemak tradition here. Here's another set of dates. These are from 4 hearths that were excavated in the Kenai area. These are the dates, AD 1410, 1420. Here's the actual place where the date came from. So that's what, 4142, that's this date right here. And this is 4145, that's that date right there. And 4148 is this one, and this is, whoops, kind of crossed it over, coloring not being my strong forte. So what we're trying to prove here is that the dates came from the hearths, came from the charcoal right under the sod, and give a window into when the sedentary Denaina occupied these prehistoric houses. I think of them as the last fire, because you open up the sod and what you see is the last fire, the charcoal, and we'll all have that experience one day, the last fire at our place. Here are some of those hearths. There's the stain of where the hearth was. There's another one. This is at Californsky Village. And we will, in a moment, I'll show you a drawing of what the hearths looked like. They essentially were a log crib that would then decompose, spread out, and that's what you find in the soil, and that's very datable material. That's what we want to date, is those hearths. So this is a typical Denaina site. We'll come to this picture again of the sedentary Denaina. Here's Kenai Peninsula College right here. This is the Kenai River, and this is Slycock Creek. Slotnu is the Denaina term. Little Creek, Slotnu. Slotnukak, Little Creek Mouth, would be this area right here. And for those of you who live in this area, when you drive down College Road, you are essentially driving down a Denaina site as you drive toward Kenai Peninsula College. There are 5 houses along this creek. This is a fairly high ridge right here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I think there's a hint of another one here. 6. And all of these blue dots are underground cold storage pits. So these were mapped with a DGPS unit, which is accurate to about 30 or 40 centimeters. Highly accurate, and I had seen a lot of these before I got that unit, but I had no really good way to map them. Excuse me, because a lot of trees, you can't just be cutting down trees to map. So this DGPS unit was a real lifesaver as far as being able to map these. And I had a student named Gilbert Berkman who worked on that project, and we mapped, I think we got most of the storage pits and the houses. And this green dot here is a spring, and that spring flows year-round. I've been down to it at 20 below, so I know it flows at 20 below. Even though the creek would be frozen, the river would be frozen, the spring still flows. And wintertime, if you do any winter camping, the first thing you need to access is water, and boiling snow takes a long time. Chopping ice is hard work to get to the flowing water, which is decreased in this little creek, but to have a spring is a really valuable thing. So this is a perfect setting, and we're going to develop the point that the Denaina shifted from the previous riverine tradition, which would involve targeting red salmon or sockeye salmon, to targeting the king salmon, early run kings that go up this creek to spawn, and in particular the late run silvers or coho that go up this creek and other tributary creeks to spawn. So the villages were located along these, and the storage pits then stored the salmon for wintertime and other use. This is a Denaina house. They're hard to photograph, so here's a wall, here's a wall, here's a wall, and right in front of me is another wall. And this one has a back room that's hard to see back here. So they appear as these sort of berms along in the ground. If you didn't know what you were looking for, you'd just think it was a fallen tree or something. But they form a pattern, and once you see one, then you can see the rest. I should have drawn that in. It sort of looks like this, 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 and so on. So inside was dug out, semi-subterranean, and the back room is back there. This is how they map out, so we can map them using a meter tape, and the berm defines the outside. The structure then would have been in here, and almost always they have adjoining rooms. One is very common, two is common, sometimes three. So these adjoining rooms would function in a number of ways, sometimes as an extra bedroom, sometimes as a menstrual room, and sometimes as a sweat bath, sweat area. Nele would be the Denaina term for that. And this would be the entrance here. So this looks like they had two entrances, entrance and an exit. And this is one of those houses that's along that site at Slycock Creek. So they're targeting the late run silvers and using a weir, something like this. A student using Osgood's description did this drawing a number of years ago, and I've used it since. He gave it to me as a project. So the fish are swimming upstream, the river's flowing from left to right. They would have this sort of gate-like thing, which of course allows the water to pass through. The fish come in. It's described that they would net them or pitch them out on shore where they'd be cleaned and processed. And when you weren't fishing, you'd open the gate here, and the fish would swim on through, and therefore you would have your escapement, which would be critical. There's no sense taking any more fish than you need, because that's just extra work and no one would want to do that. We'll talk later about ceremonies that were involved in the taking of fish, the first salmon ceremony, and stories associated with fishing that undoubtedly go back into this early time. But for now, we're more interested in the development of this type of fishing, targeting both the early run kings, but especially the late run silvers, because you're going to put the fish in a cold storage pit, and you want to minimize the time between when you catch the fish to when you freeze it, so it minimizes the amount of time for rot to occur or bacteria to occur. And this meant a shift from highly nomadic to sedentary life. So these villages spring up along these good fishing places, and people then began living in these nichilsh, or houses. This would be a model, for example, of one of the 5 houses of the site I just showed you. Generally a model of all of Denaina houses, exterior rooms, a log structure, shingled, so to speak, with beach rye, and the top shingled with birch bark. That would then be covered with sod and a smoke hole in the roof, and that's home. This is a drawing of the inside of one. This is taken from both archaeological dimensions and from Cornelius Osgood's description, which you have in your packet. You have all of Osgood's book, and he has a description of the houses. So the inside is semi-subterranean. The benches along either wall. It was said that the young men would sleep on top of the benches, and there undoubtedly would be caribou furs and maybe sea otter pelts and other types of furs. The parents slept in compartments underneath the benches. These were about 4 feet tall, so they weren't quite as short as I've illustrated it here. And the unmarried daughters lived in another set of on the other side, again lined with furs. The fire hearth was described as a 4 foot by 4 foot by 2 foot high log crib filled with sand. So the hearth, the fire would be built on top of it. The sand then acts as a heat sink to absorb the heat, and so even though the fire goes out or dies down, warmth would emanate from this very efficient style hearth throughout the night. And of course the first job in the morning, it was said to be the young boys or young men were sent out to get more firewood, build up the fire, keep the fire going. The universal symbol of warmth and home and family, the northern fire. Smoke went up through a smoke hole in the roof, and by adjusting the door, bear hides or other types of hides at the door, you want the draft to come in and out and take the smoke out of the room. And by clever manipulation of that, the inside would be relatively smoke-free. Not saying it's totally smoke-free, but it would have been relatively smoke-free. Not sure how large a family would live here, but probably an extended family. Most indigenous cultures do most of their living outside, and that would have almost certainly been true of the Denaina as well. Our modern culture, we tend to live inside. If you do most of your living outside, you don't need as much square feet. But this certainly would have been warm. It would have been a place to cook. It would have been a place to sleep. And it would have been sedentary. People don't build stout log houses like this if they're nomadic. This is an indication of sedentism. And the sedentism is a consequence of an adaptation to salmon and the storage of salmon for the winter times. Here's a few historic photos. This is a photo in the late 1890s by H.M. Weatherby. This is titled Humpy's Family. I take this to be Humpy. Humpy appears in the 1900 census with his family, although at this here is said to have been taken at Humpy Point, which is just south of the Kasilof River. In the 1900 census, he was identified as living in Nikiski, but it's almost surely the same Humpy, Stephen Humpy, in this particular case. Here's his bikudini, that's his kayak, and probably drying racks here, and this is his house. So this has a lot of indications of that old Nichil style house. This is probably his sweat bath area. You can see the chimney going up cleverly through the ladder there and held up. So this was probably where the sweat bath was. He probably had a metal stove, whereas previously it would have been something else. But here's the log structure and the vertical planks, and semi-subterranean. Here's another photo, this being in Kenai. Same H.M. Weatherby took this photo. He was the head of the cannery. This is a little less indicative of the traditional style Nichils. By this time axes would have come in and notching would have been practiced. The others were sort of friction fit and tied off with spruce root. But this is another of early photos of the houses. Just might note that the people here are how should I say it? How do we want to say it? These are leery of the photographer. The photographer was in the process of becoming the most powerful man in Cook Inlet. H.M. Weatherby, a white man, head of the cannery. So this is a photo of colonialism. This is a photo of occupation. This is a photo of becoming second-class citizens in their own homeland. So the eyes tell the story of that experience, which we will try to depict later on as we get into the course. Well, excavation of these, I've done a number of excavations. A number of other people have as well. Dave McMahon's been involved, Doug Rieger's been involved, other people have been involved, and here's some just that are from my files, so just to give you an idea what it's like to be on an archaeology dig. This is Gloria Wick, who is Denaina herself, and that was a great experience for her to be on that site. I kind of like this picture here where you've got the old Denaina house and you've got a modern Kenai house right there. Old and the new, same landscape, same territory, different culture. This is the Sachansky site, and this was the first excavation of a Denaina house that I was involved in 1970, I think it was 1974. And this was done in connection with what was then Alaska Methodist University. And this is Bill Workman, well-known archaeologist in Cook Inlet. So we put together this project. He brought 3-4 students down, and I had about 10 or 11 students from the college here in Kenai. And we excavated this house. At the time, we didn't really know what we were going to expect. We did expect a lot of artifacts, but we didn't find them. In fact, we found one. And that was this spear point. And we weren't sure why. Artifacts, archaeologists like to find artifacts. They like to measure them. They like to count them. They like to do all of that. And in particular, the basis of archaeology is to infer from artifacts aspects of behavior. And that with no artifacts, you don't have that route of inference. You have to use other tools. But at the time we just thought, well, maybe there weren't many artifacts of this particular one, but here's another set of, here's a month's work at 4 Denaina houses and 2 artifacts. These 2 right here. And this one is this one, same artifact right here, was broken, 3 different pieces in the hearth, and this one was found in a wall. So, what's going on? And I thank Peter Kalifornsky for helping me understand the process and through some of the stories. And the description of this is in a paper that you have in your readings by myself and Danita Peter, now Danita Slauson, and I believe it was 2007. So you'll get a better description there. But the essence of the idea is that Denaina believed that artifacts, as well as places, by the way, could absorb information about the history of their use. And if it was negative, it was called bagesh. If it was positive, a good thing, it was called bagesha. The reverses the action, so it negates it. Bagesh and bagesha. Artifacts could absorb information about their use, and then that information would exude from the artifact. It was described in the stories as being like a scent that could be detected. Animals could detect the information. Certain people called Ka'echeltani, powerful people, could detect the information. Others who were spiritually aware could detect the information. If it were animals, animals might withdraw from an area if they detected a bad story, bad information. And places too could exude the same scent. The question is not for us whether it's right or wrong. We respect beliefs for what they are, but it also explains why there are few artifacts in Denaina sites. The Denaina were cautious about the disposal of their artifacts because of the potential for driving away the animals. And so they carefully controlled the artifacts, and when a person died, their bodies were cremated. We will talk about that later in the course. But their artifacts were cremated with them at a place distant from the village. So that cremation purified the artifact so it no longer gave off the scent, and so it was now benign. So this explains much about archaeological sites and why there's so many houses. They're large. You would expect to find many artifacts both in the house and outside the house, but you don't. And it's because of spiritually driven practices, spiritually driven beliefs. Archaeology could never deduce that from just the artifact alone or lack thereof, but I believe it is this powerful explanatory factor. As we move into historic time, at historic sites, we see that we begin to see artifacts. And that is likely because of a shift in belief, but also a shift in the origin of the artifact. Now the artifacts are of Western or European origin, and they don't have the same necessary capacity to absorb information. And so the artifact record in historic sites is relatively large. I don't know how many thousand beads we found at Californsky Village, for example, but a lot, and other types of artifacts as well. But in these earlier pre-contact sites, very few artifacts. Bagesh and Bagesha. Bagesh is bad. Bagesha is good. When Peter Californsky translated the Lord's Prayer, he used these concepts. When he translated the second line of the Lord's Prayer, and that is in your book as well, the second line being, "Hallow it be thy name," and he translated it as something as hallowed, as something like no bagesh. Your name has no bagesh. Your name has no bad essence. And that was carrying on that ancient idea of things having a good and a bad essence. Another spiritual practice that we see in archaeological sites is the practice of burning animal bones in the fire or distributing them in the water. So this is a practice that relates to a kind of reincarnation. So there were measures that were taken, described in the stories, to carefully deal with animal bones from the bones that were hunted. You never walked on them, you never scattered them about, and you burned them in the fire, or if there were water animals, you distributed them in the water, and that was said to cause the spirit of the animal to go to a reincarnation place. That place was presided over by Kaunta Jalan, the mother of everything over and over. Her husband was Gujun, the father of the animals. Kaunta Jalan was said to be a beautiful woman, and that then the animals were said to put on their clothes and come back again as animals. Correct practices, correct attitudes resulted in nature replicating itself. In a sense, that's a spiritual or mythological form of ecology, of our modern concept of ecology. If we take care of it, nature replicates itself. There are a number of stories related to this. Peter Kalifornsky has a story of belief in things one cannot see and belief in things one can see. And I would urge you to read that story. The short version of it is a man, young man, always a young man, doubted the wisdom of the elders. And he was out hunting, and some mice were around his camp and bothering him, so he took scalding water and poured it on them and killed them. And that's a taboo in traditional Denaina culture. You don't do that. You don't kill for no reason. It's probably true in most indigenous Alaskan cultures. You don't kill for no reason. But he did, and he began to have bad dreams. It began to haunt him. He began to dream of the place where the animals are reincarnated, and he'd see the beautiful woman, and she'd say to him, "I know you," almost like she's pointing at him. "I know you." And she said, "These are the animals you mistreated." And she points to them, and they're horribly disfigured, unable to return to the human land to become animals again. And he sees how the animals that are treated correctly are returning to the human land. And as he approaches the beautiful woman from behind, she turns around and there's I think it's a big mouse that's looking at him, something like that. Well, it haunts him, so to resolve the issue, he tells his story in front of the people. And that was a kind of therapy, I think. But the story ends, but he was not himself anymore. So Denaina believed that there were essences or souls that were permanent, and humans and animals had those souls. Objects had Begesh or Begesha. Through fire and water rituals, humans and animals were reincarnated, and human cremations included the deceased person's possessions so that they were purified in that way. And we'll develop these beliefs further, but I think that these beliefs help explain a lot about what we find in Denaina archaeological sites. The houses then were large and permanent, multi-roomed, central hearth, usually on top of a ridge, near a tributary salmon spawning creek. Houses were widely spaced. They didn't live nearby. I forgot to point that out in that map, but they weren't in tight little compounds. They were spread out 100 meters, 200 meters apart. A few artifacts reflecting the belief system that I just talked about, and few animal bones reflecting the belief system. I should mention that when we get into historic sites, we start seeing some animal bones again, particularly moose bones. But moose are said to be relatively recent, at least on the Kenai Peninsula, and perhaps other areas as well. So they are going to respond to different ideological practices. So let's talk about the shift from caribou to salmon. There is increasing evidence that large salmon runs correlate with warmer temperatures. That's being worked on today because we're in a warm period. We're in the midst of global warming, and is that going to shift the nature of salmon runs, or at least move them? And there's a medieval warm period that on your first set of slides that correlates with the rise of the sedentary Denaina. So what was happening here, to go back, they were targeting the silver salmon because they had invented those underground cold storage pits, and shifting to intensive salmon cultures. There's Slycock Creek, creeks like this. And what they invented were these Estlin tow. So here's a couple of meters across, dug down into the ground with a layer of birch bark. That's the blue here. In with moss insulation in between, creating a thermal unit. The birch bark is waterproofing, and the moss, of course, is insulation. In the fall, when freeze-up starts, they would put in a layer of fish and let it freeze. Then a layer of grass, and then another layer of fish, let it freeze, and so on until the whole pit was full. The grass gives you an easier way to break into the frozen block of fish later in the winter. And then cover the whole thing with the same birch bark, moss, birch bark lining, and logs or whatever on top. So that's the 100 or so cold storage pits that are found at this site that I pointed out to you, and other sites are very similar. Here, Sherry Doob is standing by one of these pits that's right near the college. They're quite deep, and as I say, sometimes 2 meters deep, usually about 1 meter deep, something in that area. So these are a remarkable invention. I can't overstate how important this was, because it solved the problem of how to store fish for leaner times when the fish aren't running. So later in the fall and the winter, so something like this is going to stay frozen throughout the winter, well into the next spring before the fish start running again. And it's simple, elegant, but it did require labor. So we will develop the case when we talk about social organization of how this enhanced clan-based labor, because the clan then owed their labor to the village for this, for making and building these. So there weren't just one of them. There were 100 that we've identified. We don't know that they were all used at one time, but likely a substantial number were used at one time. Just as a sidelight, 2 years ago, here at Kenai Peninsula College, we excavated one in the winter, in late November and early December. It's an area that's being developed now as a dormitory site, and we wanted to gather as much information from this cold storage pit, or a set of them. There were 4 of them in this area. So I got some volunteers and got some students, and we went out in the winter and we dug. And here's it's hard to see here, but here's the cold storage pit right there, as it appears in the wall. And here the student has drawn it and captured that information for posterity. And that was a lot of fun. We had a big bonfire, and we had food, and I don't know, it was just nuts, but it was fun, because you do what you have to do. And we carried out this dig with some great volunteers. So let's talk about the shift from the riverine Kachemak. Remember, we talked about them, and they were drift net fishing targeting sockeyes or reds. And now we have this shift to the Denaina, displacing the riverine people, targeting the kings and silvers. In essence, I think you could say that this was a better system, a more efficient system, an evolutionary superior system, because of the cache pits, because of the cold storage pits. The riverine people did not have a way to store the fish in large numbers. the Denaina did have a way to store fish in large numbers, and that became the basis for displacement. Whether the displacement was amicable, whether it was hostile, just how it went, I don't know. We'll work that out someday, or somebody will work that out. But you can make the case, I believe, that there was an evolutionary efficiency for the Denaina style as opposed to the riverine style, resulting in sites like this. This can only occur in a few places in Alaska, and I'm going to try to argue here that it occurs in Denaina territory and Ahtna territory, but not in other areas. What do you have to have for this to occur? First of all, you need to have frozen ground. So this is the approximate line, this blue line, of the boundary between mean annual November through March temperatures that are below 32 degrees Fahrenheit and above 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And the Kenai Peninsula, Denaina Territory, is, of course, in that area, as is Upper Ahtna Territory is in that area. You could not have this system in Tlingit Territory because it's not cold enough. The ground doesn't freeze. Doesn't freeze in Kodiak regularly. Doesn't freeze out on the Aleutians. So this marks part of the area where you do have frozen ground. Of course, we have large salmon runs in other areas as well. But if we look at this map, this is the permafrost map. So here's the Kenai Peninsula. It's white. That means no permafrost. The teal colored is sporadic permafrost. This blue color is discontinuous permafrost, and the pink is continuous permafrost. So that plays into it because you got to dig a lot of pits, and digging these pits is very difficult in solid permafrost areas. So even though there's a lot of salmon out in the Nushagak in this area, and the Kuskokwim, Yukon areas, permafrost would tend to inhibit the extensive use of these underground cold storage pits. So this area becomes important, and the teal areas become important. That's sporadic, and this area becomes important. So frozen ground in winter, but not permafrost. Here's a map of ecoregions in Alaska, and this also portrays quite well the areas that would be conducive to the cold storage pit technology. The Susitna Kenai Peninsula area, the Mulchatna Lake Clark area, and the Upper Copper area in Ahtna Territory. Remarkable invention. So let's summarize it. Age-old mixed hunting gathering, emphasis on caribou. Then you have a potential influx of salmon about 1000 AD. Invention of underground cold storage pits, resulting in sedentary salmon fishing culture with food storage capability and a higher degree of cultural complexity. And that cultural complexity we will describe as we talk about other aspects of Denaina culture. The take-home, I believe that the Denaina culture that emerged in Cook Inlet and the Lake Clark, Mulchatna area was one of the world's most sustainable societies. That's an important point to make. We study a lot, or we learn a lot about what unsustainability looks like. Jared Diamond has written a book called Collapse. What are the characteristics of societies that collapse? It also behooves us to understand what are the characteristics of societies that are sustainable. And the Denaina culture, as it existed before European contact in this area, I think was one of the world's most sustainable societies, and we should know about it. The core being salmon. that wonderful, remarkable, highly nutritious resource that formed the basis of some of the salmon cultures of the world, who were these great sustainable cultures. The Jamon culture, for example, of Japan, operated for almost 10,000 years, and much of that as a salmon culture. These are sustainable cultures. And we're coming to a crisis with those cultures. There are no salmon cultures left relying extensively on wild salmon, except the Denaina of the Kwijak drainage and the Yupik of the Nushagak and Kwijak areas. All the rest of the salmon are somehow impacted, or politically they are prohibited. People are prohibited from taking salmon, or they're farmed salmon, or they're bioengineered salmon. But wild salmon cultures, there are only a few left. So we should know about them. Thank you. It's been a long lecture. I hope you've been able to get through it in different parts. And we will go on and we'll talk about other aspects of Denaina culture in subsequent lectures. Thank you.